The rain poured down relentlessly as Nathan stumbled through the streets of New York. His worn-out sneakers splashed through puddles, and his hoodie was soaked, but he didn't care. His mind was racing, heart pounding, and with each step, desperation grew heavier in his chest. He was running out of time. It had been 2 days since he last saw his little sister. Emily had been taken from him, ripped away by people who didn't care about the lives they destroyed. He had tried everything, begging, borrowing, even stealing a little just to keep her safe. But now, things had gone too far, and he needed more than just luck or prayers to get her back. He needed a miracle. Just as Nathan was about to collapse, he noticed a sleek black car parked outside a high-end restaurant. It looked completely out of place on this rainy night, surrounded by the empty streets. The restaurant, famous for catering to the city's wealthiest, was almost like a beacon of hope in Nathan's bleak world. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance. Without thinking twice, he sprinted toward the entrance, his heart thudding in his chest. He didn't belong here. He knew that. But right now, he didn't have the luxury of shame. He pushed open the doors, ignoring the stares from the polished guests who sat comfortably inside, laughing and sipping their expensive wines. His eyes darted across the room, searching for someone, anyone, who could help. And then he saw him. Sitting at the far end of the restaurant was the man everyone in the city knew by name, but few had ever met. Alexander Hayes, billionaire, philanthropist, the man who could solve any problem with the stroke of a pen. Nathan's breath hitched. He had read about Alexander in the news, about his endless wealth, his charity work. Some called him a savior. Others, a man with too many secrets. Nathan didn't care what they called him. Right now, Alexander was his last hope. With trembling hands, Nathan approached the table. "Mr. Hayes," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, you have to help me." Alexander slowly raised his eyes from his meal, his sharp blue gaze locking onto Nathan's. There was no warmth there, no sign of sympathy. For a moment, Nathan felt a wave of regret. What was he thinking, coming here, begging in front of a man like Alexander Hayes? "Why should I?" Alexander's voice was low and smooth, completely calm as he leaned back in his chair, studying Nathan with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. Nathan swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. He had prepared a speech on the way here, rehearsing every word in his head, but now his mind was blank. All he could think about was Emily, the sound of her voice when she begged him not to let them take her away, the fear in her eyes. "Because if you don't help me, I'll lose her. My sister, Emily. She's only 10, Nathan's voice cracked. "They took her. And if I don't get her back, they'll—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Just thinking about what might happen was enough to make his knees weak. For the first time, something flickered in Alexander's expression. It wasn't pity, but there was a brief moment of recognition, a glimpse of something deeper behind those cold eyes. He glanced down at his watch, as if he was deciding whether this conversation was worth his time. "And what makes you think I can help you?" Alexander asked, his tone still emotionless, though now there was a slight edge to it. Nathan's hands clenched into fists, the frustration and panic rising inside him. "Because you're the only one who can. I've tried everything. I've gone to the police, I've tried raising the money they want. But it's too much. I can't do this on my own." Alexander remained silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the soaking wet boy in front of him. Nathan could see the wheels turning in his head, as if he was weighing the value of the situation. Nathan hated this, being judged, being scrutinized like some kind of puzzle that needed solving. But he was out of options. "Sit down," Alexander finally said. His voice clipped. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Nathan did as he was told, sliding into the chair across from Alexander. His heart raced, but he felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe Alexander would help him, and he'd get Emily back before it was too late. "I don't give out charity, you know," Alexander said, his eyes now locked on Nathan's. "Whatever you're asking me to do, it comes with a price." Nathan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'll do anything," he whispered. "I don't care what it takes." Alexander leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Anything, huh?" There was a faint, almost cruel smile on his lips now. Careful what you offer, kid. Once you're in, there's no turning back. Nathan felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. I'll do whatever it takes. Just help me save her. Alexander stared at him for what felt like an eternity, the tension between them thickening with every passing second. Finally, he spoke again, but this time, his voice was softer, almost as if he was speaking to himself. Your sister, you said? What's her name? Emily, Nathan whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. Alexander's eyes darkened for a moment, and something changed in his expression. It was brief, but it was there. A flash of vulnerability, quickly hidden behind the mask he always wore. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. All right, he said, his voice low. I'll help you, but you're going to owe me more than you can imagine. Nathan's stomach twisted with both relief and dread. He didn't know what Alexander meant by that, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was Emily. He would deal with the rest later. For now, he had hope. Nathan sat frozen in the chair, his mind spinning from Alexander's words. You're going to owe me more than you can imagine. The weight of that promise settled over him like a cold fog, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it now. Emily needed him. She was out there somewhere, scared and alone, and every second wasted was another second closer to losing her for good. Alexander didn't say anything for a moment. He simply studied Nathan in silence, as though waiting for him to break. The restaurant around them carried on as if nothing had happened. Couples chatted softly, forks scraped against plates, and the quiet hum of wealth and luxury filled the air. It was a world Nathan didn't belong to, and he could feel every pair of eyes in the room judging him for daring to intrude. Finally, Alexander leaned forward, breaking the silence. Tell me everything, he said, his voice calm but commanding. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Nathan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to focus. This was his one chance. He couldn't mess this up. They took her 2 days ago, he began, his voice low. Emily and we've been on our own since our mom passed away last year. It's been hard. I'm only 17, and I dropped out of school to take care of her. I thought I could handle it, but, he paused, his throat tightening. The memories of the last few months flooded his mind. Sleeping in shelters, barely scraping by, always one step away from losing everything. I borrowed money, Nathan continued, his voice shaking with guilt. From the wrong people. I didn't know what else to do. Emily was getting sick, and I couldn't afford the medicine. So I went to them, and at first, they seemed like they wanted to help. But then things got out of control. The debt kept growing, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pay them back fast enough. Alexander's expression remained unreadable, but Nathan could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on him. He swallowed hard, pushing himself to keep going. 2 days ago, they showed up at our apartment. I wasn't there. I was out trying to get more money. When I came back, she was gone. They left a note saying that if I didn't pay what I owed in 3 days, I'd never see her again. Nathan's voice cracked on the last word, and he had to clench his fists under the table to stop himself from breaking down. I don't have that kind of money. I tried everything, going to the police, selling what little we had left, but no one's going to help a kid like me. Not in this city. Alexander remained silent, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the story. Nathan could feel the doubt creeping in. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe Alexander didn't care. Why would a billionaire waste his time helping some nobody from the streets? But then Alexander spoke again, his voice colder now, more businesslike. Who are these people? Names? Locations? Anything you know? Nathan blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. I don't know much. Just that they call themselves the Ferris crew. They run loans and gambling rings in the lower parts of the city. The guy in charge, his name is Travis. He's the one who took Emily. Travis Ferris, Alexander murmured, more to himself than to Nathan. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, Nathan saw something flicker in Alexander's eyes. Was it recognition? Hatred? He couldn't tell, but it was enough to make his pulse quicken. You know him? Nathan asked, his voice filled with a desperate hope. Alexander's expression darkened, but he didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood up, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a sleek, black cell phone. He dialed a number with precision, then brought the phone to his ear. Nathan watched in confusion as Alexander paced in front of the table, his movements sharp and deliberate. "It's me," Alexander said into the phone, his voice low but authoritative. "I need a location on Travis Ferris. Now." There was a pause, followed by a short reply from whoever was on the other end of the line. Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do it quickly. I don't care what strings you have to pull." He hung up and turned back to Nathan, his face set in stone. "We have a few hours before I get the information I need. In the meantime, you'll tell me everything about this debt. I want to know exactly how much you owe and how deep you're in with Ferris." Nathan stared at him, wide-eyed. "You're going after him?" He could barely believe what was happening. One minute, he was wandering the streets, hopeless and alone. And now he was sitting across from a billionaire who was about to take on one of the most dangerous gangs in the city. It didn't make sense. Why would Alexander Hayes care about someone like him? "Don't get ahead of yourself," Alexander warned, his voice sharp. "I'm not doing this out of the kindness of my heart. You said you'd do anything to save your sister, and I'm holding you to that." Nathan nodded quickly, his heart hammering in his chest. "I will. Whatever you want." Alexander's eyes flickered with something dark, something Nathan couldn't quite place. "Good. Because once we start, there's no backing out. You'll be in this as deep as I am." Nathan swallowed hard, but he didn't hesitate. "I understand." For the first time, Alexander's expression softened, just a fraction. "You'd better," he muttered under his breath before glancing down at his watch. "Let's get moving. You're going to need more than just luck to survive what's coming next." Without another word, Alexander strode out of the restaurant, and Nathan had no choice but to follow him. The night air was cold as Nathan followed Alexander out of the restaurant. His mind was a blur of fear, hope, and a deep unease that he couldn't shake. He had expected rejection, maybe even pity, but certainly not this. A promise of help from a man who lived in a world Nathan could never hope to understand. And yet, here they were, standing on the wet sidewalk, the glow of streetlights reflecting off the pavement as Alexander's driver pulled up in a sleek, black sedan. "Get in," Alexander commanded, barely giving Nathan a glance as he opened the door and slid into the back seat. Nathan hesitated for a moment. His heart raced as he stood there, his sneakers soaked, his hands shaking. Could he really trust this man? Alexander had made it clear that his help wasn't free, and the way he spoke earlier made Nathan's skin crawl. But then he thought of Emily, her small, scared face flashing in his mind, and he pushed his doubts aside. He had no choice. He climbed into the car. As the door closed behind him, sealing them off from the outside world, the tension between the two was almost suffocating. Alexander sat across from him, his face illuminated by the dim light of the city flashing past the tinted windows. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nathan sat fidgeting with his hands, trying to come up with something to say, but no words seemed right. The luxury of the car around him felt wrong. He didn't belong here. Every second, he felt the widening gap between his life and the one Alexander Hayes lived. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "You've never been this deep in before, have you?" Nathan blinked, unsure how to respond. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this." Alexander nodded slightly, as if the answer had been obvious. He crossed his arms, his gaze still distant. "Ferris doesn't care about the money. Not anymore. Once he takes someone, especially a kid like your sister, it's no longer about the debt." Nathan's stomach twisted at the words. "Then what is it about?" Alexander looked at him then, his cold blue eyes locking onto Nathan's with a seriousness that made his blood run cold. "Power. Control. Ferris thrives on fear. He's not interested in how much you owe. He wants to make an example out of you. That's what this is." Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. He had known Ferris was dangerous, but hearing it spelled out so clearly, so bluntly, made it real in a way he hadn't fully grasped before. He swallowed hard, his voice barely steady. Then what do we do? How do we stop him? Alexander's expression darkened. Stopping him isn't an option, but we can still get your sister back. The trick is making Ferris believe it's not worth the trouble to keep her. Nathan's heart pounded. How? What do I have to do? Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering as if he were about to share a secret. You need to understand something, Nathan. When you make a deal with a man like me, there are no half measures. Once we start, we don't stop until it's done. Ferris won't just give up your sister because you ask nicely. He'll have to be convinced. And the only way to convince a man like him is through leverage. Nathan frowned, trying to wrap his mind around what Alexander was saying. Leverage? What kind of leverage? Alexander's eyes narrowed, and there was a cold edge to his voice now. Information, dirt, power. I've spent years building connections in this city. People who owe me favors, people who can make things happen. But none of that comes cheap. Nathan swallowed hard. And what do you want from me? Alexander leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee, as if considering his next words carefully. Ferris and I have a history. He's made moves against me before, and I've let him slide, until now. But this? Taking your sister? It gives me an excuse to go after him. And I will. But you'll have to help me. Nathan's hands gripped the seat. Help you how? There's a warehouse, Alexander said, his voice calm but with a dangerous undercurrent. It's where Ferris keeps the people he's taken. You'll need to go there, tonight. Find out where your sister is being held. If you can get inside, if you can find out exactly what Ferris is doing there, I can use that information to tear him apart. But it has to be you. No one else will be able to get in. Nathan's chest tightened with fear. Me? But I don't know how to do something like that. Alexander raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. You said you'd do anything for your sister, didn't you? Nathan nodded, his mouth dry. I did. I will. Then prove it, Alexander said quietly. You want Emily back? This is how we do it. But once you go in, there's no turning back. Whatever happens in that warehouse, you need to be ready. Nathan's heart raced. He felt like he was being dragged into something far bigger, far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But what choice did he have? If this was the only way to save Emily, then he had to do it. The car came to a stop in front of an old, run-down building on the outskirts of the city. It was a stark contrast to the luxury they had just left behind. The windows were boarded up, graffiti covered the walls, and the street was deserted. This is where you start, Alexander said, nodding toward the building. There's a man inside. His name is Danny. He works for Ferris, but he's got a soft spot for kids. If anyone can help you get in, it's him. Nathan stared at the building, his stomach churning with anxiety. What if he doesn't help? Alexander's expression remained cold. Then you find another way. Nathan turned to face him, his eyes wide with fear and determination. I'll do it, whatever it takes. Alexander nodded once, satisfied. Good. I'll be waiting for your call. Don't take too long. Nathan swallowed hard, pushing open the car door and stepping out into the cold night. As the car pulled away, leaving him alone in front of the dilapidated building, reality hit him like a punch to the gut. This was it. There was no turning back now. Nathan stood in front of the crumbling building, staring at the rusted door as if it might swallow him whole. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst through his chest. Every instinct screamed for him to turn around, run, and never look back. But he couldn't. Emily was out there, trapped somewhere in this nightmare, waiting for him to save her. He had promised her that he'd protect her. Now, it was time to make good on that promise. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing the door open. It creaked loudly in protest, echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the air was thick and stale, the scent of mildew clinging to the walls. Nathan's stomach churned, but he forced his legs to keep moving. The hallway stretched ahead of him, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb. Shadows twisted and stretched, playing tricks on his mind. He could almost hear his own heartbeat, a constant drum in the overwhelming silence. The farther he went, the more he questioned everything. Was Alexander setting him up? Could he really trust a man like him? Nathan shook his head, pushing those thoughts aside. He didn't have time for doubt. He needed to focus. As he reached the end of the hallway, a heavy door loomed in front of him, the peeling paint a sickly green. This was it. Danny was supposed to be behind that door, the only person who could help him get closer to finding Emily. Nathan hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. What if Danny wasn't there? What if this whole thing fell apart before it even started? Before he could let the fear take hold, Nathan forced himself to turn the handle and push the door open. Inside, the room was small, cluttered with old furniture and papers strewn across the floor. A man sat hunched over a table, scribbling something onto a notebook. He was in his late 30s, with messy brown hair and a tired face that looked like it hadn't seen sleep in days. His clothes were wrinkled, stained with grease and God knows what else. Nathan could hear the faint sound of a radio playing somewhere, the static breaking through the muffled music. The man, Danny, it had to be, didn't look up as Nathan entered, but he spoke in a gravelly voice that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. If you're here to collect, you're wasting your time. I'm done with all that. Nathan swallowed hard. He didn't know how to start this conversation. He'd never dealt with people like this before. I'm not here for money, he managed to say, his voice shaky. Danny finally looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he took in Nathan's appearance. Then what do you want? He asked, his tone skeptical. Nathan stepped farther into the room, trying to stand a little straighter, even though his hands were trembling. I need your help, he said, his voice growing steadier. My sister, she's with Ferris. They took her, and I don't have much time. Alexander Hayes said you might be able to help me find out where she is. At the mention of Alexander's name, Danny's expression shifted. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Hayes, huh? So you're working for him now? There was a bitter edge to his voice, like he had some history with Alexander that Nathan didn't understand. I'm not working for him, Nathan clarified quickly. He's just helping me. I'll do whatever it takes to get my sister back. But I need to know where Ferris keeps the people he's taken. Danny raised an eyebrow, studying Nathan closely. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, do you? He muttered, shaking his head. Ferris doesn't just let people go. And Hayes, if he's involved, that means this is bigger than just a kid and his sister. Nathan's heart sank. He had suspected there was more going on, but hearing it confirmed made the pit in his stomach grow deeper. I don't care how big this is, he said, his voice firm. All I care about is getting Emily out. Please, Danny. I don't have anyone else to turn to. Danny sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. For a moment, he looked like he was going to send Nathan away. But then he stood up, crossing the room to a filing cabinet shoved into the corner. He rummaged through the drawers, pulling out a folded piece of paper and tossing it onto the table in front of Nathan. Ferris runs his operations out of a few warehouses around the city, Danny explained, his voice low. But there's one place he keeps off the radar. Only a handful of people know about it. His safe house, if you can call it that. It's not far from here, on the edge of town. If she's still alive, that's where she'll be. Nathan's eyes widened as he stared at the paper. How do you know about this place? Danny gave a humorless laugh. Because I've been there. I used to do some work for Ferris, until I saw what he was really about. The people he keeps there, they don't come out the same, if they come out at all. A chill ran down Nathan's spine, but he forced himself to stay focused. How do I get in? Danny hesitated, then pulled out a small key card from his jacket pocket and handed it to Nathan. This'll get you through the front door. But once you're inside, you're on your own. Ferris has guards, guys who won't think twice about killing anyone who gets in their way. Nathan took the key card, feeling its weight in his hand. His pulse raced, but there was no turning back now. Thank you, he whispered, his voice filled with determination. I'll get her out. I have to. Danny gave him a sad smile. You've got guts, kid. Just don't get yourself killed. Hayes might be willing to help, but he's not the type to save you twice. Nathan nodded, understanding the warning. He slipped the key card into his pocket and turned to leave, but Danny called out to him one last time. Nathan, he said, his voice softer now. Whatever you find in there, don't let it break you. Ferris is a monster, but people like Hayes, they're not much better. Watch your back. Nathan paused, letting the words sink in. He had no idea what he would find inside Ferris's safe house, but he knew one thing for sure. He was walking into a war far bigger than he had ever imagined. And the only thing keeping him going was the thought of Emily's face, the sound of her laugh, the promise that he would bring her home. Without another word, Nathan left the building, stepping back into the cold night. He glanced down at the keycard in his hand, feeling the weight of the next step pressing down on him. The city streets stretched out before him, dark and unforgiving. Somewhere out there, Emily was waiting for him. And Nathan knew that no matter what it took, he had to be ready for whatever came next. Because once he stepped through that door, there was no going back. The safe house loomed in front of Nathan like a fortress, an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. Its brick walls were cracked, the windows shattered and boarded up, giving it the look of something long forgotten. But Nathan knew better. Inside those walls, Ferris held his sister, and tonight, Nathan was going to get her out. His heart pounded as he approached the building, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. There were no lights outside, but the faint hum of electricity buzzed through the air. Nathan's eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. The only sound was the distant hum of the highway behind him. But he knew better than to assume the place was empty. Ferris's men would be inside, watching, waiting. Nathan's grip tightened around the keycard Danny had given him. It felt heavy in his pocket, like a loaded gun he wasn't sure how to use. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, but also the moment he had been preparing for. Everything hinged on what happened next. He circled the building, looking for a discreet entrance. His eyes landed on a metal door, half hidden by a stack of rusted barrels. Nathan moved quickly, slipping the keycard into the slot beside the door. For a split second, he feared it wouldn't work, that the information Danny had given him would turn out to be a lie. But then the lock clicked, and the door slid open with a faint hiss. Nathan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold night air. He stepped inside. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with peeling paint and exposed pipes. The air was musty and thick, making it hard to breathe. Every step Nathan took felt louder than it should have, the scuff of his shoes echoing down the narrow corridor. His body was tense, his mind on high alert. Any wrong move could give him away. He didn't know where to go, but the building seemed to stretch endlessly before him, with doors leading off into the darkness. Somewhere in here, Emily was waiting. He had no idea how he was going to find her. Ferris could be keeping her anywhere, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. Time was slipping away. As he moved deeper into the building, Nathan's thoughts kept racing back to Danny's warning. Whatever you find in there, don't let it break you. What had he meant by that? What kind of horrors was Ferris hiding inside this place? Nathan turned a corner and froze. Voices. He pressed his back against the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. The voices were coming from a room just ahead, the door slightly ajar. He crept closer, inch by inch, careful to stay out of sight. Through the crack in the door, he saw two men standing guard, both of them armed, their expressions bored as they talked quietly to each other. Nathan's stomach twisted. If those men saw him, it was over. He had no weapon, no plan, just the hope that he could sneak past them without being noticed. Think, Nathan, think. He scanned the hallway, searching for something, anything, he could use. His eyes landed on a metal pipe lying discarded against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver through his fingers. Taking a deep breath, Nathan crept forward, keeping to the shadows as he moved. His heart raced in his chest, every muscle in his body tense. The guards were still talking, completely unaware of the danger lurking just outside the door. And then, in one swift motion, Nathan struck. The pipe slammed into the back of the first guard's head with a sickening thud. He collapsed instantly, hitting the floor with a heavy crash. Before the second guard could react, Nathan swung again, this time catching him in the side of the head. The man stumbled, groaning in pain, but before he could reach for his gun, Nathan brought the pipe down one last time. Silence. Nathan stood there, panting, his hands shaking as he dropped the pipe to the floor. The two guards lay unconscious at his feet, their guns untouched. He stared at them, his heart pounding in his ears, struggling to believe what he had just done. I have to keep moving. He stepped over the bodies, his legs trembling, and continued down the hallway. His hands were slick with sweat, his breathing shallow, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. Finally, after what felt like hours of wandering through the maze of corridors, Nathan found a door that looked different from the others. It was reinforced with steel, a keypad glowing faintly beside it. His stomach twisted with both fear and hope. This had to be it. Nathan stared at the keypad, his mind racing. There was no way he could guess the code, but then he remembered the keycard. With shaking hands, he swiped it through the slot. For a moment, nothing happened. His heart sank, and then, with a quiet beep, the door unlocked. Nathan pushed it open, his pulse quickening as he stepped inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by a single light hanging from the ceiling. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, but when they did, he saw her. Emily. She was huddled in the corner, her hands bound, her face streaked with tears. She looked so small, so fragile, and for a brief second, Nathan couldn't breathe. His little sister, the girl he had promised to protect, was right there in front of him. "Emily," Nathan whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Her head snapped up, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto his. "Nathan," she gasped, her voice weak and hoarse. Without thinking, Nathan rushed to her, dropping to his knees and pulling her into his arms. Tears streamed down his face as he held her close, the relief overwhelming him. I'm here, he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm going to get you out of here. I promise." Emily sobbed into his chest, her small body shaking as she clung to him. "I was so scared," she whimpered. I thought I'd never see you again." Nathan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. We're getting out of here." But as he untied her hands and helped her to her feet, a new wave of fear washed over him. They weren't safe yet. Ferris's men were still out there, and if they were caught now, there was no telling what would happen. Nathan held Emily's hand tightly, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't go back the way he came, not with the guards he had taken out. They'd have to find another exit. "Stay close to me," Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're going to sneak out, okay? Just stay quiet." Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear but full of trust. Nathan squeezed her hand, giving her a reassuring look, even though his own fear was gnawing at him. Together, they moved silently through the darkened hallways, the danger lurking around every corner. Nathan's heart raced as he and Emily slipped through the dark hallways, every creak of the floorboards sending jolts of fear through him. His grip on Emily's hand was firm, trying to steady her trembling body while his mind worked at full speed, searching for a way out. The corridors twisted in a maze of shadows, with every turn feeling more dangerous than the last. His throat was dry, and he could barely hear anything over the pounding of his own heart. They moved quietly, hugging the walls and staying out of sight. Nathan's senses were on high alert, his ears straining for any sound that might signal danger. A footstep, a door creaking, anything. The building was eerily silent now, as if holding its breath, waiting for the chaos to begin. He glanced at Emily. She looked pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she was holding herself together. That gave him strength. He had to be strong for her. No matter what, he was going to get her out of here. Nathan's mind was racing through options. The way they had come in was too risky now. The guards might be waking up any minute, and the last thing he wanted was to get cornered with nowhere to run. He needed a new plan. As they rounded a corner, Nathan spotted a metal staircase leading down. His instincts told him that it might be a way out. Basement exits were often neglected, hidden, and hopefully less guarded. He hesitated for a moment, weighing the risk, then tugged Emily toward the stairs. "We're going this way," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily didn't argue. She just nodded, trusting him completely. They descended the stairs as quietly as they could, each step creaking under their weight. The walls here were damp, the smell of mold stronger, and the flickering light overhead cast long, ominous shadows. Nathan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't afford to lose his nerve now. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in what looked like an old storage area. Rows of rusted metal shelves lined the walls, filled with broken tools and crates covered in dust. The space was cramped, but at the far end of the room, Nathan could make out a heavy steel door. His heart leapt with hope. That had to be an exit. "We're almost there," he whispered to Emily, squeezing her hand. "Just stay close." But as they approached the door, Nathan's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. He slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. Then he saw it, a small security camera tucked into the corner, its red light blinking softly. Nathan cursed under his breath. There was no way they could open that door without being seen. If someone was watching the feed, they were about to blow their cover. "What do we do?" Emily whispered, her voice shaky. Nathan's mind raced. He couldn't go back, and now that they'd been seen, staying hidden wasn't an option either. They had to move fast, but running blindly wasn't going to help. He looked around the room, searching for anything that could help. Then, in the corner, he spotted an old tool cart. On it was a crowbar, covered in dust. An idea sparked in his mind, and though it wasn't much, it was all he had. "Stay here," Nathan whispered to Emily. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear but full of trust. Nathan grabbed the crowbar and carefully made his way over to the camera. His heart pounded as he stood beneath it, trying to angle his body so that his face wouldn't be fully seen. He held his breath and swung the crowbar with all his strength. The camera cracked and sputtered, sparks flying as it was ripped from its mount. The red light blinked out, leaving them in darkness once again. Nathan turned to Emily. "We have to go. Now." They ran to the steel door. Nathan grabbed the handle and yanked, but it didn't budge. It was locked. He swore under his breath, looking around frantically. There had to be a key or some kind of release mechanism. His eyes landed on a control panel next to the door, a keypad like the one he had seen earlier. His pulse quickened. "Please work," he muttered, pulling out the keycard Danny had given him. He swiped it through the slot, praying that it would unlock the door. For a second, nothing happened, and Nathan's heart sank. Then, with a soft click, the door unlocked. Nathan wasted no time. He shoved the door open, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her through. The cold night air hit them like a wave, filling Nathan's lungs and making his heart race with both fear and relief. They were outside, but the relief didn't last long. As they stepped into the open, Nathan's worst fear became reality. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured but their intent clear. Ferris's men had found them. "There they are," one of the men growled, pulling a gun from his belt. Nathan's body went cold. Without thinking, he pushed Emily behind him, his mind screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped between the men and the building they had just escaped from. The second man stepped forward, his eyes cold and merciless. "You thought you could just walk out of here?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Ferris doesn't let anyone walk away." Nathan's mind raced, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had to think, had to do something, but every option seemed impossible. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and all he had was a crowbar. "I don't want any trouble," Nathan said, his voice shaking but firm. "I just want my sister. Let us go, and we'll disappear. You'll never see us again." The man with the gun laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about the money anymore. It's about sending a message, and that message starts with you." Nathan clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He could feel Emily trembling behind him, her small hand gripping his jacket, and the weight of that fear fueled him. He couldn't let them take her, not again. The man raised his gun, pointing it directly at Nathan. Time seemed to slow down, every second stretching into an eternity. Nathan's pulse roared in his ears, his vision narrowing to the barrel of the gun aimed at his chest. And then, out of nowhere, a car screeched to a stop at the edge of the lot. The headlights blinded everyone for a split second, and Nathan felt Emily's grip tighten on his jacket. The two men turned toward the car, confused, their weapons still raised but their attention momentarily diverted. The driver's door flew open, and Nathan's heart skipped a beat. It was Alexander. "Get in the car." Alexander's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. He didn't wait for a response. He had already stepped out of the car, pulling a gun from his coat and aiming it at Ferris's men. Nathan didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Emily's hand and ran. They sprinted across the lot, their feet pounding against the pavement as they raced toward the car. Nathan's heart was in his throat, the world around him a blur of noise and adrenaline. Just as they reached the car, a gunshot rang out. The gunshot tore through the air, sharp and deafening. For a brief, terrifying moment, Nathan thought it had hit him. His body tensed as he dove toward the car, pulling Emily with him, his mind screaming that this couldn't be the end. Not now, not when they were so close to freedom. But the pain never came. Instead, the sound of chaos erupted behind them. Alexander had fired first, and Ferris's men ducked for cover as bullets ricocheted off the metal containers and concrete surrounding them. Nathan shoved Emily into the back seat of the car, heart pounding as he threw himself in after her. Alexander, already behind the wheel, slammed his foot on the gas before the door was even closed. The tires screeched against the pavement as the car lurched forward, tearing out of the parking lot and onto the empty road. Nathan could barely breathe, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He twisted in his seat, looking back to see Ferris's men shouting, one of them already grabbing his phone, likely calling for backup. They hadn't been hit, but they weren't giving up either. "They're going to follow us," Nathan shouted, his voice tight with panic. Alexander's eyes remained focused on the road, his expression stone-cold and unreadable. "Not if I can help it," he muttered, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he pushed the car to its limits. The streets outside were a blur of lights and shadows as they sped through the city, weaving through narrow alleys and deserted back roads. Emily huddled next to Nathan in the back seat, her small body trembling as she clung to him, her face buried in his jacket. "It's okay," Nathan whispered, trying to calm her, though his own heart was still racing. "We're going to be okay." He said it more for himself than for her, desperate to believe it. But in the pit of his stomach, fear twisted like a knot. They weren't safe yet. Behind them, the distant roar of engines grew louder. Nathan glanced over his shoulder and felt his blood turn to ice. Two dark SUVs were barreling down the road, their headlights blazing as they closed the distance between them. Ferris's men weren't about to let them go without a fight. "They're gaining on us." Nathan's voice was tight with urgency. Alexander didn't even blink. "I know." The car swerved hard to the right, taking a sharp turn into an industrial area filled with warehouses and abandoned lots. Alexander drove with precision, expertly navigating the winding roads and narrow alleys. But no matter how fast they went, the SUVs kept coming, relentless in their pursuit. Nathan's mind raced. He had no idea how they were going to outrun them. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely out of options. His grip on Emily tightened as the car skidded around another corner, the tires barely holding onto the slick pavement. Alexander glanced in the rearview mirror, his jaw clenched. "There's a storage yard up ahead. I'll try to lose them in there." Nathan's heart pounded as they sped toward the entrance of the yard. The towering stacks of shipping containers loomed ahead, casting long shadows in the moonlight. It was a maze of metal and concrete, a perfect place to disappear, if they could pull it off. The car flew into the yard, Alexander weaving between the rows of containers with surgical precision. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually lose their pursuers. But then the SUVs followed, their engines roaring as they closed in. "They're not backing off," Nathan shouted, panic rising in his throat. He could hear the screech of tires behind them, feel the weight of the chase pressing down on his chest. Alexander's eyes darted between the containers, searching for an escape route. "Hold on," he warned, his voice calm but deadly serious. Without warning, he slammed the car into reverse, backing up fast into a narrow gap between two stacks of containers. The sudden change in direction threw Nathan off balance, but Alexander didn't stop. The car shot forward again, taking a sharp left into a dead-end corner. "What are you doing?" Nathan's voice cracked with fear as the dead end loomed closer. But Alexander wasn't panicking. "Trust me," he said, his voice low and steady. At the last possible second, he spun the car to the side, squeezing it into a small space between two containers that barely fit the width of the vehicle. The maneuver was so fast and precise that the pursuing SUVs sped right past them, missing the turn completely. Nathan could barely believe it. The SUVs roared by, disappearing around the corner, their drivers unaware they had lost their targets. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the heavy breathing coming from Nathan and Emily as they sat frozen in the back seat. Alexander exhaled slowly, his grip on the steering wheel relaxing just slightly. "We'll wait here until they're gone," he said, his voice calm and controlled. Nathan nodded, though his heart was still racing, his body tense with fear. He turned to Emily, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Are you okay?" he whispered. Emily nodded, her eyes wide and filled with tears. "I'm okay," she whispered back, though her voice trembled. "Nathan, I was so scared." "I know," Nathan said softly, pulling her close, "but we're safe now. We're going to be okay." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. The danger wasn't over yet. They had escaped for now, but Ferris wasn't the kind of man to let things go. He would send more men, track them down, and there was no telling what would happen when he caught up with them. Nathan glanced at Alexander, who was still watching the road carefully, his eyes narrowed in thought. For a moment, Nathan wondered what was going through his mind. Alexander had risked his life to save them, but why? What did he really want? Before Nathan could ask, Alexander spoke, his voice low and serious. "This isn't over. Ferris won't stop coming after you." Nathan's stomach dropped. He had known it all along, but hearing it out loud made the reality sink in. "Then what do we do?" Alexander's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, locking onto Nathan's. "You're going to disappear. Both of you." Nathan blinked, taken aback. "Disappear? How?" Alexander's gaze was cold, calculating. "I have connections, people who can make you and your sister vanish. New identities, new lives. Ferris will never find you." For a moment, hope flared in Nathan's chest. It sounded like a way out, a chance to finally be free from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. But then doubt crept in. "What's the catch?" Alexander's expression didn't change. "There's no catch, Nathan. I'm offering you a way out because you did what you promised. You helped me. Ferris has crossed a line, and he's not my problem anymore. But if you stay, if you try to fight him head-on, you won't survive." Nathan's mind spun, torn between the fear of running and the hope of escape. But before he could answer, Emily spoke up, her voice small but determined. "Nathan, I don't want to be afraid anymore. I don't want to keep running." Her words cut through him like a knife. He looked down at her, at the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion that weighed on her small shoulders. She was only 10, but she had been forced to endure so much. How could he keep dragging her through this nightmare? Nathan's jaw tightened as he made his decision. He turned to Alexander, his voice steady. "We'll take your help." Alexander nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Good. Then we start now." Without another word, Alexander shifted the car back into gear, pulling out of the hiding spot and disappearing into the night. The car cut through the empty streets like a shadow, the city blurring by as Alexander drove with precision and speed. Nathan sat in the back seat, holding Emily close, his mind still reeling from the decision he'd just made. They were going to disappear, vanish from the life they knew, leaving everything behind. It felt surreal, terrifying, but also like their only hope. For the first time in months, the constant weight of fear lifted slightly from Nathan's chest. But in its place came a new kind of dread, a fear of the unknown. What would their new lives look like? Where would they go? And most importantly, could he trust Alexander? Emily's small voice broke the silence, pulling Nathan from his thoughts. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, her head resting against his arm. She looked so fragile in the dim light, her face pale from the ordeal they just escaped. Nathan hesitated, not knowing how to answer. He looked up at Alexander, hoping for some kind of clarity. "We're heading to a safe house first," Alexander said without looking back, his eyes fixed on the road. It's not far. We'll lay low there for the night, then move you both out of the city. Nathan frowned. And after that, where do we go? Alexander's grip tightened slightly on the wheel. Someplace no one will find you. I have people who handle this kind of thing. By tomorrow, you and Emily will have new names, new identities, and a fresh start. You'll be off the grid. Nathan's stomach twisted. A fresh start. It sounded simple enough, but deep down, he knew there was no erasing everything that had happened. They couldn't just wipe away the fear, the pain, the trauma of the last few days. Could they? Emily shifted beside him, her eyes wide and full of uncertainty. Will we be safe there? Nathan forced a smile, brushing her hair back gently. Yeah, Em, we'll be safe. I promise. But the words felt hollow. How could he promise something like that when the future was so uncertain? The car continued down a series of narrow, winding roads until they reached an isolated area on the edge of the city. The streets were empty, the buildings old and run down, with broken windows and crumbling facades. It was the kind of place where no one would think to look for them. Alexander pulled up to a small, unremarkable house at the end of the street. It looked abandoned, the paint peeling from the walls, the windows covered with grime. But Nathan could tell this was no ordinary safe house. It was meant to be invisible, blending into the decay around it. This is it, Alexander said, cutting the engine. He turned to face Nathan, his expression serious. Stay inside. Don't make any calls. Don't leave for any reason. I'll be back in the morning with new documents and everything you'll need. Nathan nodded, his throat dry. Okay. Alexander's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, as if searching for any sign of hesitation. You're doing the right thing, Nathan. It's the only way to keep her safe. Nathan looked down at Emily, who had fallen asleep against his arm, her breathing soft and steady. He knew Alexander was right, but the weight of what he was giving up, everything he'd known, their entire past, pressed heavily on his chest. There was no turning back now. Thank you, Nathan muttered, barely able to get the words out. Alexander didn't respond. He simply gave a curt nod, then opened the door and stepped out of the car. Nathan followed, carefully lifting Emily in his arms as they approached the front door. The house was cold and dark inside, but Nathan was too exhausted to care. He carried Emily to a worn-out couch in the living room, laying her down gently before collapsing into a chair nearby. For a long time, Nathan sat in the darkness, his mind racing. He had been running for so long, constantly looking over his shoulder, always afraid that the next step would be his last. Now, in this broken-down house, with Emily sleeping peacefully nearby, he felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Was this really the end of the nightmare? Or had they just stepped into another one? The hours passed slowly, the silence around them deafening. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made Nathan's heart race, his body tense with fear. He kept imagining Ferris's men bursting through the door, guns drawn, ready to drag them back into the nightmare they'd barely escaped. But as the night wore on, the exhaustion finally caught up with him. His eyes grew heavy, his body aching from the tension and fear of the day. He fought to stay awake, to keep watch, but eventually, sleep overtook him. He didn't know how long he'd been out when the sound of the front door opening jolted him awake. Nathan's eyes shot open, his heart leaping into his throat. He instinctively reached for Emily, but she was still fast asleep on the couch. His pulse quickened as he heard footsteps approaching, the soft creak of the floorboards sending waves of panic through his body. And then he saw him, Alexander, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "It's time," Alexander said quietly, stepping into the room. He was holding a small duffel bag in one hand, his eyes flicking briefly to Emily before landing on Nathan. "Everything's ready. We need to move now." Nathan blinked, his mind still groggy from sleep. He glanced out the window, where the first faint rays of dawn were just starting to break through the horizon. It felt too soon, too sudden, but he knew there was no time to waste. He stood up, gently shaking Emily awake. She stirred slowly, rubbing her eyes as she looked around the unfamiliar room. "What's happening?" she asked sleepily. "We're leaving, Em," Nathan said softly, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. It's time to go. Emily nodded, too tired to ask any more questions. She trusted him completely, and that trust only made Nathan's heart ache more. He wished he could explain everything to her, make her understand why they had to keep running, but there was no time. There was never any time. Alexander handed Nathan the duffel bag. Inside, you'll find new IDs, some cash, and a burner phone. Use it only if absolutely necessary. From now on, you're Jacob and Lily Carter. You've never been anyone else. Nathan stared at the bag in his hands, the weight of his new life pressing down on him. Jacob Carter. It felt like a stranger's name, like someone else's identity being forced onto him. But he had no choice. Where do we go? Nathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's eyes darkened slightly. I have a contact waiting for you outside the city. He'll take you to a place where Ferris won't find you. From there, you'll be on your own. Nathan swallowed hard, nodding. And Ferris? What happens when he comes looking? I'll handle Ferris, Alexander said, his tone cold and final. He won't be your problem anymore. Nathan wasn't sure if that was a promise or a threat, but he didn't push for more details. He just wanted this to be over. With a final glance around the room, Nathan took Emily's hand, leading her toward the door. The weight of everything they were leaving behind, every memory, every piece of their old life, hung heavily in the air. As they stepped outside, the early morning light cast long shadows over the quiet street. Nathan took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. This was it, the moment they disappeared. Stay safe, Nathan, Alexander said, his voice low. And remember, don't look back. Nathan nodded, gripping Emily's hand a little tighter. He didn't say anything as they walked toward the waiting car, his heart pounding in his chest. As the car pulled away, leaving Alexander behind, Nathan felt a strange mix of hope and fear. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, the path wasn't full of terror. It was uncertain, yes, but it was also a chance for a new life. A chance to be free. And as he held Emily close, watching the city fade behind them, Nathan made a silent vow to himself. No matter what happened next, he would protect her. He would make this new life work. For both of them. And they would never be afraid again. The hum of the engine was the only sound as the car sped away from the city, its tail lights fading into the distance. Nathan sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the world blurred by. Emily rested her head on his lap, exhausted from the night's ordeal, her soft breathing a reminder of everything he was fighting for. But as the car took them farther from everything they knew, Nathan's thoughts spiraled. He was no longer Nathan. He was Jacob now, a man without a past. The driver, a man Alexander had arranged for, didn't speak. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a cap, and his focus remained fixed on the road. Nathan didn't mind the silence. It gave him time to think, to process what was happening. But no matter how hard he tried, the fear lingered at the edge of his thoughts, gnawing at him. Can we really disappear? The question echoed in his mind. He glanced down at Emily, her small body curled up beside him, and a wave of guilt washed over him. He had promised her safety, but even now, that promise felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. What if Ferris found them? What if this wasn't over? Hours passed in a blur. The city lights had long disappeared, replaced by open fields and winding roads that stretched toward the horizon. Nathan's grip tightened on the duffel bag Alexander had given him, the weight of their new identities pressing heavily on his chest. Everything about them was inside that bag. New names, new lives, everything that would define who they would become. The car slowed as they approached a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of a quiet, forgotten town. The neon sign flickered above, casting a dull red glow across the cracked parking lot. The driver pulled up to the front of the building and finally spoke, his voice low and gruff. This is where you'll be for the night. Someone will meet you in the morning to take you the rest of the way. Nathan nodded, his throat tight with uncertainty. He gently shook Emily awake, her sleepy eyes blinking as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Come on, Em, Nathan said softly. We're here. Emily rubbed her eyes, clearly confused. Where are we? We're safe, Nathan said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if they were safe, but for now, it was the only thing he could offer her. They stepped out of the car, and Nathan quickly thanked the driver, who nodded and drove off without another word. The air was cold, carrying the scent of rain and wet asphalt. Nathan pulled Emily's small jacket tighter around her shoulders as they made their way toward the motel entrance. Inside, the motel was exactly what Nathan had expected: old, dingy, and barely maintained. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow over the peeling wallpaper and worn-out furniture. The clerk behind the counter didn't even glance up as Nathan approached. He simply slid a key across the desk, muttering something about room 8. Nathan took the key, his hand shaking slightly. He hadn't realized just how exhausted he was until now. The adrenaline that had carried him through the last 24 hours was starting to fade, leaving him with a bone-deep weariness that made his legs feel like lead. They found their room at the end of the hall. Nathan unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing a small, cramped space with 2 twin beds and a single lamp flickering in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a brief sanctuary from the chaos they had barely escaped. Emily collapsed onto one of the beds, her body curling up under the thin blanket. Nathan sat down on the edge of the other bed, rubbing his hands over his face as the weight of everything crashed down on him. The fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping them both safe. It was all too much. He glanced at the duffel bag beside him, the new IDs and cash tucked away inside. Jacob and Lily Carter. The names felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. Someone stronger, someone who knew what he was doing. But Nathan had no choice. He had to become that person. For Emily. Are we really safe now? Emily's voice was small, almost a whisper. She was sitting up in bed, her wide eyes full of questions she didn't know how to ask. Nathan forced a smile, though his heart ached. Yeah, Em, we're safe. No one's going to find us here. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for any sign of doubt. But Nathan kept his expression steady, even as the fear gnawed at him from the inside. After a while, Emily nodded, satisfied with his answer. She lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and within minutes, she was asleep again. Nathan stayed awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. His mind raced, filled with images of Ferris, of Alexander, of the men who had chased them through the city. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Ferris wouldn't give up that easily, and Nathan knew it. Even with new identities, even with Alexander's help, there was always a chance they would be found. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Not ever. Hours passed, and Nathan drifted in and out of restless sleep. Every sound from the hallway outside, every creak of the floorboards, jolted him awake, his heart pounding in his chest. But no one came. The night stretched on in silence, broken only by the soft hum of the motel's flickering lights. As the first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains, Nathan finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had made it through the night. They were still safe. For now. Just as Nathan was starting to relax, a knock echoed through the room. He froze, his body instantly tensing. His mind raced, heart thudding in his ears as he stared at the door. Who could that be? His first instinct was to grab Emily and run, but they had nowhere to go. They were stuck here, in this small, dingy room with only a few dollars and a bag full of new identities. The knock came again, this time louder, more urgent. Nathan stood up slowly, glancing at Emily to make sure she was still asleep. He moved toward the door, every step feeling like it was dragging him closer to something terrible. He reached for the handle, hesitating for just a second, his breath caught in his throat. Then, with a deep breath, he opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a man, tall, with a weathered face and sharp, watchful eyes. He wore a dark jacket, his hands stuffed into his pockets, and his gaze locked onto Nathan with an intensity that made his stomach twist. "You're Nathan, right?" the man said quietly, his voice calm but firm. Nathan's blood went cold. "Who are you?" The man's expression didn't change. "I'm the one Alexander sent. I'm here to get you out of here." Relief flooded through Nathan's body, but it was tinged with caution. He didn't trust anyone anymore, not completely. But this man, he was their only way out. Without another word, Nathan grabbed the duffel bag and gently woke Emily. She rubbed her eyes, confused and groggy, but she didn't ask questions. She simply held Nathan's hand as they stepped out of the room, following the man down the hallway. The sunlight outside was blinding after the dimness of the motel, and for the first time, Nathan felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe they were finally going to escape the nightmare. But as they climbed into the car waiting for them outside, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He glanced at the man driving, his jaw tight with tension. He had saved them, yes, but at what cost? And what did Alexander really want? As the car pulled away, heading toward a future that was still uncertain, Nathan tightened his grip on Emily's hand. He had made it this far, and no matter what happened next, he wasn't going to lose her. He wasn't going to let anyone take her from him again.